Marvel needs to let Gwen Stacy die. Now I know what you're probably thinking. Jug, Gwen Stacy has been dead for over 50 years now. What do you mean that Marvel needs to let Gwen Stacy die? Well, it's actually a little complicated, so just hear me out. For context, Gwen Stacy is one of Spider-Man's most iconic and popular love interests, probably number 2 right behind Mary Jane. But even though she's number 2, she might be just as critical, if not more so, to Spider-Man's development as a character. Gwen Stacy's death became one of the defining moments of Spider-Man's career. Like Uncle Ben, Spider-Man was unable to save Gwen, debatably actually even causing her death, and this would not only shatter him, but haunt him for the rest of his life. Although this moment crushed Spider-Man, it also taught him how to be a better hero. It was one of the moments that would basically solidify the idea that Peter could never have a normal life because of the pain and suffering it would cause for those around him that he loved. And from a meta perspective, the death of Gwen Stacy is seen by many to be the marking of the end of the Silver Age of comics and the beginning of the more gritty and dark Bronze Age. So if Gwen Stacy died over 50 years ago and her death was so important to comics, why am I saying that Marvel needs to let Gwen Stacy die? Well, I'm not saying Gwen Stacy isn't important, or that the comics should forget her, or that she should be removed from any future movie or television adaptations. No, that's not the case. And yes, I know Gwen Stacy is literally dead in the comics, but Marvel needs to let the character rest. It seems that every so often Marvel resurrects or clones or force ghosts Gwen Stacy to bring her back and have her visit Peter for some reason. And Marvel seems to milk this every chance they get with the variant covers and sneak peek previews and leaks so that they can sell as much as possible. I'm not saying Marvel's all about money, but they do use money to run their business, and they do like money. But not only all that, Marvel also milks Gwen Stacy with variant covers of her in different costumes, which eventually have led to variant characters of Gwen from different universes, such as Spider Gwen, who, by the way, I have absolutely no problem with. I think Spider Gwen's a really interesting character, and I love what they're doing with her in some of the comics, but more in the Spiderverse movies. However, they've started to milk Spider Gwen, Gwen Stacy variants too. So, let's go through this. How many times exactly has Gwen Stacy reappeared in Peter Parker's life? Well, the first return of Gwen Stacy was only about 2 years after her actual death in the original Clone Saga. Marvel fans at the time were absolutely pissed off that they had killed off Gwen Stacy, and Stan Lee, who was receiving a lot of flack from fans at Comic-Con, wanted the hate to stop, so he asked writer Conway if there was some way he could just write Gwen Stacy back into the comics. Conway obviously didn't want to. I mean, he was part of the reason that Gwen Stacy was killed off in the first place. But eventually Stan wore him down, and he and Stan agreed that Conway could write Gwen back out of the comics whenever he wanted. So Conway decided to come up with a story to write Gwen back in, and that's how we got the first Clone Saga, kind of. That's an oversimplification. There's a lot more that went into the Clone Saga. In this story, Gwen reappears perfectly healthy but with no memory of her life, and she interacts with Peter, and this sends Peter spiraling, and he has no idea what's going on or how Gwen's back, and he's absolutely losing it until he realizes that this isn't actually Gwen. After dealing with this Gwen and some other versions of himself, Peter realizes that this isn't Gwen, and this is actually a clone version of herself created by the villain the Jackal. When this Gwen discovers that she's a clone, she decides to leave and start a life of her own, accepting the fact that, she wasn't the one who was actually in love with Peter, and this isn't actually her life she's living. Then in 1988, the High Evolutionary captures the Gwen clone, and he determines that Professor Warren had done well creating a clone, but it was imperfect. So to perfect the cloning process, the High Evolutionary abducts some random woman off the street and injects her with some DNA sample that contains the genetic material of Gwen, transforming this woman from being a human being who already existed into being a copy of Gwen. I don't know how that's exactly cloning. After a ton of convoluted storylines and retcons, this person who was once a person and is now Gwen starts a new life as a woman named Joyce Delaney. All is well for Joyce Delaney and she has a happy life. That is until the second Clone Saga, when you find out that she's married. And she's actually married to a clone of the Jackal, Miles Warren. For some reason he cloned himself and somehow got to marry this lady who used to be a human being but is now Gwen. And this Joyce Delaney Gwen eventually sees something that reminds her of Spider-Man, and then she starts to remember her life. So long story short, she goes to New York and decides to help Spider-Man, blah blah blah. Clone Saga stretches out for so long, this Joyce Delaney lady eventually moves to London and starts a new life. Which, I mean, good for her. Her life has already gone to crap, so I'm happy she's able to escape all this Spider-Man drama. But in London, she's actually murdered by another Gwen Stacy clone. This one named Abby L, who's a failed Degeneration clone, which Degeneration has like this virus. It's kind of like, if you know Kane from the 90s, this failed Spider-Man clone. It's like that. This Gwen killed her. So I guess Joyce's life sucked. Yet another Gwen clone appears in Amazing Spider-Man number 399, and this Gwen clone's like, I'm the real Gwen, I'm not a clone. And then she degenerates and dies. Now a further Gwen clone, our fifth one to date, appears when the Jackal returns. She's kind to Peter and Kane, one of the aforementioned clones of Peter, but she's actually like a slave to the Jackal and does his bidding. When the Jackal is ultimately defeated in this storyline, the Jackal's base, is burning down, and Kane decides to be kind and try to help this Gwen, Kane being Peter's clone. But this Gwen refuses help and seemingly dies in the fire. Alright, so we got about like 5 Gwen clones right now, so you could be saying that Marvel's milking Gwen's death and Gwen as a character, but we're not even close to done. In another Spider-Man story, not only does Gwen reappear in a number of flashbacks, like this disgusting one, where she's actually making love to the Green Goblin and we get to see the Green Goblin's O-face. I'm not diving into that because it's one of the most hated Spider-Man storylines of all time. But it turns out that Gwen Stacy actually had children with the Green Goblin. And now these Gwen Osborn children are hunting down Peter Parker because they think he's their actual father. And one of them looks exactly like Gwen, this one being the daughter, Sarah. Like, there's literally no difference between Gwen's character design and Sarah's character design. They are literally spitting images of themselves, and I don't know how, because I figured that the Osborns would pass on that nasty hairline somehow, but no, she has to look exactly like Gwen so that we can torture Peter. She must look exactly like Gwen. There can't be any difference. Peter must think it's Gwen. She and her brother are first trying to kill Peter Parker because they think he's their father, but then they eventually find out that Norman Osborn's the father, so then the brother takes up the mantle of like this Grey Goblin, and then Peter and Sarah team up to take him down, and they eventually do, but not really because he survives, and then Peter and Sarah are like, yay, and then Sarah tries to move on with her life, but she's secretly in love with Peter, which is kind of creepy because she's like, only a couple years old, she just ages quickly. I don't know, okay, I'm not gonna get into it, it's a whole thing. Next, when Peter Parker Spider-Man dies and the superior Spider-Man Doc Ock takes over his body, there's this moment where we get to see Peter go to heaven. And when Peter goes to heaven, he gets to interact with all his loved ones and all the people he feels like he failed. And he gets an inspirational speech from some of them. And some of the most important people he interacts with are Uncle Ben and Gwen Stacy. It's kind of a really nice moment to see, especially when you're like me, 12 years old, reading the comics when they're coming out, and you don't quite get that a character's never fully killed off. So I thought this was it for Peter Parker, and I was like, wow, it's nice to see him interact like this with Gwen and Uncle Ben and all the important people from his life. But most Gwen reappearances are not like that. And now, back to our regularly scheduled Gwen cloning. The Jackal has returned, but this time the Jackal isn't the Jackal Miles Warren. This time the Jackal is the Jackal's secondary original clone, Ben Reilly, being the Jackal. So a Spider-Man clone, basically Peter Parker, is now the Jackal, which kind of ruined the character of Ben Reilly for some people. But don't worry, this is only one of the many times the character of Ben Reilly gets ruined. So in this already confusing story, Gwen has now been retconned to have, when she's on the bridge and thought to be unconscious, she's actually awake and conscious. And she finds out on the bridge right before she dies that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. So she finds out that Peter Parker's Spider-Man, and then she dies, and the next thing she knows is she's waking up in like this pod thing, and the Jackal's there. So yeah, the Jackal revived her and told this Gwen that it's actually the real Gwen, not a clone. She's the real Gwen, and he brought her back to life. I mean, it seems to be true. This Gwen actually has real memories of her life, and when Peter Parker, Spider-Man, comes and interacts with her, he thinks, this is the real Gwen. But when push comes to shove in the climax, Dr. Octopus activates the carrion virus, which is basically this virus that degenerates clones, and we soon see this pile of dust where Gwen used to be, implying that she was a clone all along and was reduced to dust. After this, the next time we see Gwen is when the villain Kindred brings her to dinner to meet Spider-Man, but this is a unique reappearance of Gwen. Instead of cloning Gwen or bringing an alternate universe version of Gwen or anything of the sort, Kindred decides to exhume, dig up Gwen Stacy's body and bring it and put it at a dinner table for Peter Parker to see, along with a number of other bodies of people he's failed, like Captain Stacy, Flash Thompson, Jean DeWolf, and Ben Parker. It is really messed up, but I think it actually counts as a Gwen appearance. Finally, there was another appearance of Gwen in Judgment Day, where the Celestial known as the Progenitor is resurrected, and he comes to Earth and gives the Earth a judgment, and he decides that he's gonna give the Earth 24 hours to live, and during that 24 hours, he's gonna judge each person on an individual basis, and he will decide whether or not they are good or bad. But the Progenitor's a nice guy, so to not freak people out, he decides to come and judge people, visiting them in forms that would bring them peace, you know, a familiar face, a friend, a passed away loved one, you know? So when Peter gets visited, of course he's visited by Gwen Stacy, or at least the Progenitor in the form of Gwen Stacy. And Progenitor Gwen Stacy spends the day watching Peter as he helps his friends and loved ones, as well as helping the city as Spider-Man. The Progenitor judges Peter and deems him worthy and decides that Peter deserves a gift. And how does the Progenitor reward Peter? Well, he actually resurrects the real Gwen, allegedly, and gives Peter and Gwen one last moment together. Getting tired of talking about Gwen Stacy appearances yet? Well, we're pretty much done, except for the alternate universe and alternate timeline Gwen Stacys, which have become extremely popular. So let's get into those. The biggest and probably most recognizable alternate Gwen Stacy is Spider Gwen Stacy. And Spider Gwen Stacy is the Spider-Person of Earth 65, her own Earth. This is a universe where Peter Parker, one of Gwen Stacy's friends, died, and Gwen actually got spider powers and became Ghost Spider, but everyone just refers to her as Spider Gwen. Spider Gwen first met Peter Parker Spider-Man during the original Spiderverse event. And originally, this Spider Gwen was just a fun one-off character that kind of allowed us to see Gwen Stacy in a universe where she was Spider-Man and Peter no longer existed, and it kind of was an interesting dynamic. So interesting that fans really resonated with the character. Marvel noticed the character's popularity and of course gave Spider-Gwen her own series. Spider-Gwen's been an interesting addition, but her popularity has spurred a number of other Spider-Gwen spin-offs as well. Some of the biggest being Sandman Gwen, Doc Ock Gwen, Vulture Gwen, and Rhino Gwen. But the biggest and probably most popular would be Gwenpool. Now yes, Gwenpool isn't actually Gwen Stacy, but the design was actually based off of the popularity of Spider-Gwen mixed with Deadpool, you know? And it was just made for some variant covers, but also, like Spider-Gwen, Gwenpool was a fan favorite, and she eventually got her own series. Plus, she looks like Gwen, so I'm going to count it. Other alternate universe versions of Gwen are the Gwen from the Age of Apocalypse timeline, where Gwen never died and she actually became a bodyguard for Donald Blake. Donald Blake's the guy who used to be able to transform into Thor. Long story. This Age of Apocalypse Gwen eventually gets pulled from her timeline into the main timeline and appears on the George Washington Bridge right in front of Spider-Man, and it kind of freaks Spider-Man out. I imagine seeing the person you love who died at this bridge back at this bridge alive would be pretty dramatic. Then we have the Heroes Reborn event, which reality shifts, and this Gwen was inspired by her mother and became a psychiatrist at the Ravencroft Institute, which is basically like the Arkham Asylum of Marvel, sort of. In this story though, Gwen actually becomes a superhero. She's inspired by the death of Falcon and is trained by a character named Nighthawk and becomes Nightbird. I think it's kind of like Batman, Batgirl? Yet another reality change is the House of M event, where basically Scarlet Witch rewrote everything about the world to make mutants the ruling class, and then she gave some people the life of their dreams. One of these people was Peter Parker. For Peter, she gave him a life where Gwen Stacy was never killed and Peter Parker was still Spider-Man, so Peter and Gwen were actually married and kind of had a happy life together. I mean, the couple has a young son, Gwen's working as a businesswoman, and Peter's still Spider-Man. In this story, this obviously doesn't last. I mean, Peter gets brutally tortured. He's the writer's punching bag, come on. And I mean, that's not even the end of it. I could talk about Marvel Adventures Gwen, Marvel Zombies Gwen, Powerless Gwen, Spider-Punk Gwen, Spider-Man Fairy Tale Gwen, Spider-Man Loves Mary Jane Gwen, Spider-Man Life Story Gwen, Spider-Man Unlimited Gwen, Ultimate Spider-Man Gwen, and even all the what-if versions of Gwen. And trust me, they milked those. However, I think that's enough to back up my point that Marvel needs to let Gwen Stacy die. It has been 50 years since Gwen Stacy's death, and I think she's had more stories and appearances post-mortem than she had when she was alive. I understand that this is a significant character to Spider-Man's history, and for that reason she pulls in a lot of money whenever she's in a comic, but I think for the same reason, they should just respect the character and just stop using her. Pretty much every time Gwen Stacy has been used in a story since her death, her character hasn't been used effectively. I understand wanting to reference the character, or you might have an interesting story idea, but many of these Gwen Stacy storylines just weren't interesting, or they didn't move the plot forward in a way that justified bringing back such a critical character to Spider-Man's history. But that's just my opinion. So what do you think? Should Marvel let Gwen Stacy die? Should they resurrect her character permanently? Or something in between? Thanks for watching.